Let's hold it for a second. That's quite good. So, can we get like a close up, like on the corner, which is coming right or left corner? The right corner. So then you see like her like opening up. So I stay here but zoom in a little bit. Yeah. Even more. Can you go even more? It's more. Yeah. And then if you're just that high, it would be okay. These guys? Yeah. If we. Yeah, let's try it. Okay, let's try it.
Do the same thing?
Actually. So we lost her over here. Let's try to get her. Oh, no, I don't want. We took it from here, right? So we're focusing right now kind of in this section. So we need to slow down a little bit or whatever. Feel free what you need to do. Have your movement over.
We've got some behind the scenes with Alexa.
You put a little room for safety then? And action. There we go.
All right, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Founding Four podcast. Now, usually we are two Latinas with spicy women's hockey takes, but today we have a special guest, Laura Everrett, joining the show. Welcome.
Hi, Erica.
It was so great to officially meet you at Women's Beanpot, which we're going to talk about shortly. But first, I want people to get to know a little bit about you and what brought us both to the 45th Women's Beanpot. So what can you tell us about yourself and Boston women's sports?
Yeah, so I'm a Bostonian and relatively new to hockey. I actually came to all of this through soccer, and Boston women's sports is a new media venture, and our founding story, our villain origin story is back in 2022. I was reading our major newspaper here in Boston, and I noticed it was in November. The entire sports section managed to run without a single story of women. Whole sports section. And I thought, maybe it's a one-off. Maybe it's just one day. It happened to be Thanksgiving, lots of football rivalries, maybe one day. And so I started watching, I started looking, I started counting how many stories deep I had to go until I found women, and it was not good. So I started counting and I started posting the numbers, and I started getting angrier and angrier and angrier until January 2023, my wife comes home and I said, babe, I rage bought a web domain. We are owners of Boston women's sports. And with the audacity of a white man, I applied for press passes to the Boston Pride. And that's how we became hockey reporters.
I love that. I mean, my origin story is not too different, honestly, of the founding. Yeah. I mean, it started with going to, and at the time, NWHL games, Rivers games with my sister, and wanting to follow the team, wanting to know more about their origin stories. This is kind of the theme, if you will, of our morning skate section of this podcast, and not being able to find a lot of stories about the league. And so I'm just, as I say a lot, a curious person. So I was reaching out to outlets that existed saying, I like your stuff, keep it up. want to see more of it. And it was men running every single site that I reached out to. And then they found out that I was an athlete in college, and we're like, oh, well, you should come on the show. I was like, okay, but I don't know anything about hockey. And they're like, no, it's fine. And so long story short, here we are.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, really, like I sort of consciously avoided hockey. I grew up at a time when, and in an era, like I grew up in New Jersey. The Devils were our family's team, but I really thought, like, this is a sport for white dudes. I didn't see a path for myself to have access to this. It was the folks who had money and access who really played. And so I didn't know there was a way in for women or queer folk or people of color. And so I didn't know there was a way for me to fall in love with the game.
Wow. Unfortunately, that story is it's familiar. It sounds familiar. What's also unfortunately a little familiar is that I wish someone had put the name Sherry Ross on your radar. Sherry Ross, the boss. I got to work with Sherry Ross with the Riveters on the broadcast, and she was one of the first women to cover the New Jersey Devils, and then eventually became their radio voice, and was the first woman on New Jersey Devils radio, which is such a just wild thing that I met Sherry because of women's hockey. And then flash forward several years after we worked together with the Riveters, and I got to be part of the first ever New Jersey Devils all women radio broadcast alongside Kelly Schultz. And, that's why I do the work that I do, is because it's not as much as we, the collective we of a lot of the identifiers that you mentioned, a lot of the identifiers that I personally have. It's not that we haven't been in hockey or soccer or softball, which is what I played in college. It's just that our stories aren't told. And if they are told, they're not told well. They're not told thoroughly. They're not told often. I mean, how many stories out there can we read about Austin Matthews or Connor Bedard, but the stories about Blake Bolden for several years, there was about two of us. And yes, I'm one of the two that were writing Blake's story, just as an example. So you, with the audacity of a white man, I love that. So you started covering the Boston Pride. How'd that first game go?
So, the last time I watched hockey, there was a glowing puck, right? And it was real different going to Warrior Ice Arena to cover the Boston Pride. And the truth is, like, I went in angry and confused when I realized that there were Olympians playing down the road from me here in Boston, and they weren't getting covered in our established media outlets. So I didn't really know what I was doing, but mad credit to the Pride. Like, they were thrilled that someone wanted to cover them. And I just want to give all the credit in the world to their front office, who took a chance on us and welcomed us in. And when we got there, that press box was me and my wife and the volunteer statisticians, and that was it. And mind you, that was during the 2023 season. The Pride were making a run for the championship. They had just come off of a championship. Part of the backstory too was that time I rage bought the web domain was after a very famous columnist in this city, a male columnist, said it has been 18 months since Boston last had a championship. And he was factually inaccurate. The Pride had a championship. He just wasn't celebrating it.
Right.
And so there was no press in the box. He could have been celebrating. We were the only ones there, and we felt a real obligation to do right by these women. So I went on a crash course to learn as quickly as I could. I'm still learning a lot about hockey. I'm learning as much as I can. And part of what we're trying to do with Boston Women's Sports is educate ourselves along with our readers, because we know that as more and more people are coming to each one of the sports that we cover, not everybody knows all the rules and regs, but they want to become fans, and they don't need to be shamed for what they don't know.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And again, this is the Founding Four podcast. We are part of Black Rosie Media. I am here alongside Laura Everrett, who is a guest with us today. Usually we have Angelica Rodriguez, but we had some conflicts with the schedule. But again, my name is Erica L. Ayala, founder of Black Rosie Media, where we empower Black women and melanated creators, in particular in sports media. And yeah, it's unfortunate that the coverage for women's sports, it has these ebbs and flows. And we're going to talk about the PWHL a little bit later on the show, and of course the PWHL Boston. And next up, we're going to talk about the Beanpot. But I want to keep in mind what you just said, that first of all, a columnist, a sports columnist in Boston, factually inaccurate, but then also that there have been opportunities to cover women's ice hockey specifically in Boston prior to the PWHL Boston team, prior to the Boston Pride. And unfortunately, there haven't been a lot of people that have taken it upon themselves who arguably have the resources to cover things regularly and did not have to buy their own domain or come up with their own outlet, that haven't been coming consistently. And I guess the big question, and we probably won't get to an answer on this episode of the Founding Four podcast, but the big question that I think a lot of us have is if and how the PWHL can break that cycle. I mean, that's a big, hefty question. And I think it's a question that also you have to circle back to, of course, the history of women's hockey, but also the history of women's sports. And so I know Boston Women's Hockey covers other leagues. The NWSL finally announced their schedule today. We have the WNBA coming to Boston for the first time, playing at TD Garden. But I guess that will be in August. But let's talk about TD Garden making some history. We're going to make some history. Oh, look at this comment. Ray Roy, when I was growing up, girls played ringette, but not hockey. Now, I learned about ringette. It's I don't know it well enough to describe it, and I certainly don't know the rules, but I think that's also interesting. I played baseball. Baseball is my first love. Baseball is my first sport, and I was a baseball pitcher. And I can't speak to ringette versus hockey, but I can speak to baseball versus softball. And again, it's one of those things that, and I had a really interesting debate with someone, because a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, well, girls can't play with boys after a certain age, or women can't skate with men. And here's the thing. Some people like to equate, let's just use the NBA, for example. Oh, well, women can't play in the NBA because they can't dunk. How many dunks does Steph Curry put down on a night-to-night basis? Just as an example. I mean, for those who maybe don't know who Steph Curry is, he is a guard. He is an excellent perimeter shooter. And no, he does not dunk very often. So it's interesting that we often say there's this one particular thing that women, air quotes, can't do, and that's why we can't watch their game. When in reality, it's not even an integral part of the game. But also in the case of hockey, for example, and open ice hits, those things have been literally there are policies to take them out of women's hockey. So it's not that women can't, and it's certainly not that women don't make contact, but men, probably white men, somewhere in a room decided that they didn't want
delicate ladies shouldn't do that.
Right, correct. The same body who at least has the capability most women, not all women, but most women have the capability to birth a child from their own body. Not to mention regularly, and by regularly, I mean monthly, go through all kinds of different painful things with our body. But yeah, sure. Let's draw the line at open ice hits. But anyway, I digress. I just find it very interesting, the conversations that we have, as I'm sure you know, when it comes to sports and women in sports, they come from the male gaze, Gaze, and not from science, not from fact, but a lot of time the facts, air quotes, are derivative of assumptions and biases. But anyway, I will teach this at a university one day, but we are going to get to other things. Again, this is the Founding Four podcast. We're going to have some clips from PWHL Media Day for you a little bit later. And we're going to talk about the PWHL Boston, who, I mean, we have a segment title, but we might have to remix that a little bit given how they performed
After
last night.
night's game, yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. And we'll update, of course, on the most recent PWHL games and the ones coming down the pike. But Laura, you and I got to see a pretty exciting Beanpot championship game. 45 years of the women's Beanpot, which, for those who may not know, is a local tournament between four of the universities in Boston. It is Boston College, Harvard, Boston University, and Northeastern. And this is a tournament that happens in the middle of the regular season, and it's all about pride. It's about Boston pride, the city, that is, and it's just kind of bragging rights.
Yeah.
Yes, and for the first time in the 44 years prior, the women's game was held at TD Garden, which is NHL ice, and once again, women's hockey and women's hockey supporters showed up. I got word from Hockey East that before the game were we there on Tuesday? Before the game on Tuesday, there had only been, I think it was about 30 times that a Hockey East women's game had reached 3,000 fans or more. Laura, what was the final tally for Tuesday's game that was announced shortly after the championship, which we're going to get to in a minute?
Erica, there were 10,633 people in those stands at the Garden. That is a huge amount of Bostonians on a cold, snowy, rainy, gross Tuesday night in February. It was glorious. 10,633 hockey fans watching women play.
It was fantastic. We were there for the consolation game, which of course is between the teams that lost in their semifinals, which this year was Boston College and Harvard. And that was exciting as well. So why don't we talk about that game first, because we got some electric performances in that game, but it was decided in not just overtime,
nope,
but a shootout, Laura.
We saw some good hockey.
Absolutely. What stood out to you from that consolation game?
You know, I think those were two fairly evenly matched teams. And because Harvard is playing in the Ivies, we have 13th ranked BC. These are teams, again, we're talking about bragging rights for the city of Boston. This is a 45-year-old competition. Northeastern has the most wins at 18. All of these games in the semis had really been remarkably close this year. And so I think we were all expecting that these games were going to be tight, but that both of the games on Tuesday night went into overtime. Spoilers for folks who hadn't seen it, was really remarkable. To go into the shootout on this, it went into a shootout with Harvard scoring and then ending in a save. Just excellent hockey. And what was so remarkable for me, the lower bowl was full at this point. You were watching fans who knew what they were watching. You were watching a crowd that knew what they were observing. And so you could watch the momentum move with the crowd. They were astute in their observation. Sure, you saw the whole sections where an entire team was wearing their own sweaters. But this was really a crowd that really knew what they were watching, and they were live with the teams.
Yeah, it was really exciting because you know there were a lot of youth teams that were there, which is always exciting, but there are also a lot of alum that were there.
Yes.
And there's so much, again, history when it comes to the Beanpot. So to just kind of see these two teams really go at it and, take us all the way to a shootout was really exciting. And it ends up going in Harvard's favor. And as you mentioned, it just was, at the end of the day, it was that final stop, right, that gets it going. But we also go into overtime. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, and I was going to say, we're looking at a Harvard team under new coaching after some major scandals the prior year. I think, let's talk honestly about a Harvard team that's in the midst of some major transition. We've seen players from Harvard, there are players who have moved to Northeastern and other area schools. This is a real interesting moment for Harvard in the reestablishment of its program after a long tenured coach and a lot of internal conflict. And so, my sympathies are with players. These are all really excellent teams. Bragging rights in this city and the bravada around all of that. It's more than just who wins where. Playing at the Garden, the Garden has this mystique in the city that transcends just being NHL ice. Being in that place matters. The central infrastructure was redone in 2021. Those are new screens. To be projected on that scale, I'll say also, the quality of the pre-production was different from anything else that I've seen, whether it's at Warrior, whether it's at college games. The level of all of this, the way players were treated, the being brought in and taken out, this is a level beyond which people have seen before. And I hope that is a foretaste of the professionalism that we believe that all professional athletes playing in professional women's leagues deserve, because we know what the men get. And
right.
We believe that level of gender equity is deserved by players playing in professional women's leagues.
Very well said. And that's what the players echoed, a lot of them, when they hit the dais post game. That's what even some alum, and we'll hear from Chloe Arard, who plays for PWHL New York a little bit later. But you're absolutely right. And again, it goes back to, hearing some of the coaches also say, people didn't think we were going to get more than 3,000. People didn't think we were going to get more than 5,000. No one was going to show up for so long. And even I posted some things on social media, and seeing some legends of the Boston area comment and respond and just say, for so long, nobody thought that this was possible. And here we go, once again, women's hockey showing up. So again, it's Harvard over BC. Now the Eagles actually scored first. They got the lone goal in the first frame. Harvard then got an equalizer in the second, and then just really got, back-to-back goals effectively in the third period, nothing in the overtime frame. And then finally, you get that just final save by Emily Davidson to win it all for Harvard. Okay, but let's talk about the championship game. But before we do that, we already kind of, spoiler alert, it did go to overtime. This was my vantage point, and you'll also hear me because I have no chill. This was my vantage point of the final play of the 2024 Women's Beanpot. I mean, amazing, amazing. You could hear how electric it was. You know, you could hear even as they were playing the different songs. "Don't Stop Believin'," I think, was playing right before this, because I mean, we didn't have much overtime. There was no going to a shootout in this one. Just a fantastic play by Northeastern to win their second consecutive Beanpot. They are crushing it when it comes to this tournament. But it was Skylar Irving who got the goal in regulation and then also came up clutch in overtime.
But let's talk about that. I think it starts with Megan Carter, goes to Katie Cross. It's beautiful work. Irving gets behind the line of defense, and you just got to feel for the defensive line there. All you could do was watch that. And I mean, Irving knew what she was doing. That Selly was the one she had used earlier. Skates, drops to one knee, just big and bold, straight to the camera, drop down, celebration, owned the arena. It was gorgeous.
It was a thing of beauty. And yes, as you mentioned, the goal in overtime, Katie Knoll and Megan Carter get those assists 27 seconds into the overtime frame. It's heartbreaking, though, if you are BU, because as I mentioned, Skylar scored the first goal for Northeastern in the first goal of the game. That came in the second stanza, as I like to say. And then BU scores. Catherine Fulham scores
Beautiful.
at the 19:03 mark in the third period. I mean, this was just a bonkers championship.
It was wild. They had pulled the goalie. There was an extra player out. You did not know if this was possible. Just an incredible moment. Stadium is electric, and they pull it off.
Yeah, it was wild. And, you know, this is a BU team. I had just called their game against Vermont. Things were definitely clicking and buzzing. They're starting to get their chemistry together. Callie Shanahan got the start in this game, had been coming and dealing with injury. And so I think did a fantastic job, really. Again, this was another close game, and really just took some really gutsy play down the line. I loved, though, again, the post-game scrums and hearing the players talk about that they felt like it was an NHL's type atmosphere. Like it was just like what they're used to watching on TV. And we're starting to see that translate. It's becoming, what is expected almost from women's hockey. I mean, we could go back so many years. Again, the PWHL, I'll say it bluntly, is benefiting from a lot of the work that has been put in for decades in women's ice hockey. And particularly, they're benefiting from what's happening and the changing landscape in women's sports. I think, and I've always said this, that the PWHL, or it used to be the PWHPA, it's really hitting the marketing in a way that we haven't seen in women's ice hockey before. And so now people like us who found our way to women's hockey have been learning on the fly, if you will, and are now creating community. We're getting to reap the benefits of work and the foundation that's been laid prior to. And I think it was great to see so many connections to the women's hockey world, obviously through Hockey East and the Beanpot, but Shelley Looney was honored as one of the inductees into the Hockey Hall of Fame. She was the first ever head coach for the Buffalo Beauts. I had to mention that. My co-host, my usual co-host, Angelica Rodriguez, certainly wouldn't let me live it down if I didn't mention Shelley Looney. Corrine Schroeder got the first shout out in PWHL New York history, in PWHL League history, also honored. Unfortunately, for those who are a member of our Patreon posse, you probably heard my interview with Corrine, and she said it was going to be a tight race to get up there. Unfortunately, she didn't make it up for women's Beanpot, and you'll hear from one of her teammates, Chloe Arard, also talking about it was just a little bit of a tight turnaround. But I mean, again, so many connections. Reagan Rust is in the Beanpot Hall of Fame and was a bench boss alongside Tara Watchorn for BU in that championship game. I mean, the connections go on and on and on. And those are only the ones that I know about, Laura. I mean, it's just amazing to see where the sport is at.
Yeah. Well, and we like to claim Corrine as well from her Pride days too. It's exactly. A lot of heartbreak for those of us from Boston to see her playing elsewhere, but we still claim her Boston roots as well.
As you should, as you absolutely should. And it was interesting to talk to her again. Check out the Black Rosie Media Patreon page. We have a great conversation with Corrine Schroeder. But I asked her, because one of the things that I found fantastic about her rookie year with the Pride is that she had all of these goals. And she had a very specific number of shutouts that she wanted to pitch in her first season, in her rookie season. And she surpassed that. And I thought that was just a little fantastic nugget from covering Corrine Schroeder. And yes, her name is Corrine, everyone. Corrine Schroeder.
Because, I mean, look.
Yes, yes, go ahead.
Well, look, let's talk things that are really important. Things like pronunciation guides and pronoun guides. That's an invite for PWHL. Yep. If we're going to be fully inclusive, we've got to do those things to make sure people's names are pronounced correctly and correct pronouns are used. I had the opportunity to interview Corrine when she was with the Pride, and I remember talking about her practices of meditation because she was with such a strong offensive team. She was doing so little work at the back and what she could do to stay focused when the game was far away from her. What an incredible rookie season when she was with the Boston Pride. And so as much as we don't like seeing her, as much as Bostonians don't like seeing her on another team, I will still support players thriving wherever they are.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, at some point you got to enjoy the ride. Just not to make it about men's hockey, but, that's how I feel about Ryan Donato. He's playing with the Chicago men's team now. And, I always want to see him do well, but also his team lose when they play the Kraken. So anyway, but let's talk a little bit about PWHL Boston. What's good with PWHL Boston? Now, again, we came up with this as our second period conversation before last night's game. So, of course, we will update as we talk about this. But prior to last night, Laura, it was looking a little dicey for PWHL Boston. They were fifth and still are fifth overall in the standings. Their last game prior to last night, they fell 4-1 to the aforementioned PWHL New York. Alina Mueller, who we will talk about when we recap last night's game, led the team before last night's game with 5 points, but they were all assists. Now, again, we will update that. We have some updates there. And the power play, 1 of 9, through their first, I guess, 4 or 5 games. The PK, solid, but the power play Woof.
Yeah. So here's my thinking. We have some work to do. We have a lot of people who have not played together. And putting those lines together in ways that take individual talent and learn to play as lines that are cohesive and complementary. Admittedly, this is true for every team, but the dynamics between our individual players don't have that common history. And that is a particular challenge for Boston. And we've seen some pairings that have worked, particularly with our defensive lines. But those individual performances have not yet materialized into the kinds of offensive lines that have the scoring potential realized. Is that a sufficiently diplomatic way of saying we've got some work to do, right? It's think about this, right? Like Boston has this incredible history, particularly with Blades, with Pride. You've merged two leagues. It's not even like if you put the National League and the American League together. It's like you put the MLB and the Japanese League together. Or the Australian League and Canadian League football together. We're not even playing the same rules. So no kidding that like Knight and Mueller or Winskowski and like those lines have been scrambled 8 ways from Sunday. Coach Kessel said it best. We got players who are gripping their sticks way too tight. And what is great about last night is things seem to have settled down. And I am hopeful, deeply hopeful, going into Saturday's game at home, we're calling Lowell Greater Boston right now. You know Boston, we're the hub of the universe. We have an expansive idea of what is Boston. Lowell is Boston. We're playing in Lowell. We're going to call it Boston. We're playing in Lowell. We're back at home in Lowell. And I'm hopeful that the confidence of the win against Ottawa is going to calm some of the anxiety that was clearly showing up in the team dynamic. And maybe we're going to play with a little more confidence that, okay, some of the team dynamics can settle.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, all of the teams are going through that, and we've talked about that on this podcast. I think that you're seeing also teams that were a little more intentional with matching players that had a skill set that might blend together, and or bringing together players whose game, on paper, complements each other. I think there are some markets. I think Boston is one of them. Toronto, who we talked about on our last live stream, is one of them. Those teams, to me, fell into the trap of I'm just going to say it bluntly because it's how I feel. And I've talked about it on the show before. Yeah. But this league, the vision of this league was supposed to be best on best. The vision of this league and players who opted not to play in the former league, the PHF / NWHL. And although I understand completely and agree very aggressively with very specific reasons that they didn't want to play in that league historically, we're not going to shake ourselves from the residue of some of the more negative and quite honestly petty conversations that spun from the last 4 or 5 years of women's pro hockey. And so there were some selections. There are some usage early that are head scratching. Taylor Girard should have more of a role on special teams. Just as an example, if we're talking about Boston, This is a player that in her rookie campaign led the league in shorthanded goals, and it wasn't particularly close.
Yeah.
She played on a Connecticut Whale team whose head coach is now an assistant for PWHL New York, Colton Orr, that was, I mean, they mastered the power kill. And yet, we're not seeing Taylor Gerard given as many opportunities as I personally would like to see to flex those muscles. We talked about it last time with Toronto, and since they've fixed this a little bit, but being a little bit stubborn and having Kristen Campbell do so much work in net and not offer opportunities to Howe or Carly Jackson, who won a PHF championship last year with the Toronto Six. So, I think that we have to be critical of usage right now in the PWHL, while also understanding that usage is going to look a little different because this is a new league, to your point.
Yeah.
But at what point, and I know players have been saying this, they've been saying the team that's able to get their chemistry together quickest is going to be successful out the gate. And if we look at the standings right now, that is the Minnesota squad. Montreal actually just overtook them since we wrote up our notes because Minnesota lost the other night. But PWHL Montreal, I mean, it doesn't hurt when you have Marie-Philippe Poulin on that on that team. But another player that's been crushing it for PWHL Montreal, who's on that MPP line, Teresa Vanishova, who scored the game-winning goal in overtime over Minnesota in the PHF to win the last ever Isabel Cup championship. Boston, with their win, they did bump up to 3, and Ottawa, now they do have some work that they have to do. PWHL New York, we were with them for media day, and they feel that they're just not healthy. Unfortunately, Jill Saunier is on long-term injury. They're just getting their captain, Micah Zandy Hart, back. She was on the bench against Boston, that 4-1 win. But she was supposed to play on special teams, but there were no power plays for either team. So she didn't really get to see the ice. But they're hoping that they'll get her back full tilt. And then again, PWHL Toronto kind of holding up the rear, if you will, in this 6-team league. So again, when we came up with this segment, Boston wasn't quite getting it together, but hopefully we'll see some things change a little bit. But also, Hillary Knight's still waiting on her first goal in the PWHL. There's a few, well-known players that, to your point, they're playing with not their national team. Hillary Knight's not playing with Alex Carpenter. Amanda Kessel's not even in the league for crying out loud, which I think is bonkers. I hope. I don't know what Amanda Kessel's plans are. I am not speculating at all whatsoever. I hope that we get to see Amanda Kessel play in a league, a domestic league that, again, is really leaning into best on best, because as quiet as it may be kept, I don't understand a top 5 in women's hockey that doesn't include Amanda Kessel. But that's my soapbox. I will step down just for a moment. Ray Roy says, Howe played against Ottawa. Yes, of course she did. Finally, and like we said, like I just mentioned, finally we're seeing that trend for Toronto change a little bit. But again, it's a weird time right now, right, Laura, where you have to kind of experiment, but also almost have a short leash with those experimentations. It's not, I do not envy the job of the coaching staff or the GMs right now.
No, and it's hard with a truncated season. It's incredibly hard. I mean, look, that preseason, that wasn't real, right? Like they are still figuring out team identity and roles and clarity. And I think about someone like Sammy Davis, right? Who I think of as being an incredibly useful player, who hasn't seen minutes yet. And, you know, look, I am the furthest human being possible from a hockey coach. So no one should take this seriously. And why is Sammy Davis not playing? Right? Like, both of those things can be true. And thinking about how you build a team, build identity, and I also want to acknowledge these players are under incredible pressure. And I think this is one of the things I really grieve about women's pro leagues. I was joking the other day with a friend, like, you know, you're a fan of women's sports if you have gear from failed leagues.
Woo!
Right? That's tweetable. You know you are a fan of women's sports if you have gear from failed leagues, because this is the strain that every fan, every investor, and this is the pressure that I think, unfortunately, some of the players we've named under. You have to make this win. And wouldn't that make you grip your stick tighter?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And it's an unfair burden to an extent that I think we place, generally speaking, on women athletes, and honestly, quite honestly, that they feel themselves. Yeah. I think that also leads to, a few things. It leads to kind of this Pollyanna approach sometimes about things. It leads to, if a narrative is kind of out there, that it's not corrected, even if it's wrong. Heck, it even leads to people pronouncing players' names wrong, to the point where I have receipts of actually asking players and putting it on video, because people apparently, just don't believe me, as if I would make something up. But, it's so wild that, there are even players who, and Sophie Betty, Corrine Schroeder, Denisa Krishova, players who are at, even with their names, they're just like, you know what, just say it however you want at this point, because they're so used to the everything from their stats not being accurately kept, their names being pronounced wrong, the facilities not being up to par. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And again, I do think that there are some things that the PWHL has done that have been great. I also think there are some things that the PWHL has done that make no sense to me, such as starting a 6-team league with a 6-month runway. That doesn't make sense to me. Such as having all of this funding and investment placed into, and you can absolutely see that money was spent on broadcasting, and missing the mark on having brand identities, logos, team names ready to go out the gate. I just, it's, we have a lot still to go. And there is a lot of pressure, to your point, because what were we hearing when the league started, Laura? This, various iterations of, this has to be the league that lasts. And what's scary, as someone who knows the history of the ABL before the WNBA, I'm forgetting all of the acronyms that we had in women's soccer off the top of my head right now.
The P, right? Like we can call the roll on all of these, but
exactly.
But the underinvestment, the underreporting, and to continue to put that on volunteers and people who are spending their own funds to do that, the economic underinvestment creates systems where players can be exploited and abused. Let's talk about it. Economic, sexual, and employee abuse is rife. And this is what I worry about when you say you create a professional women's hockey league, but a base salary is $30,000. Friend, you can't live on that in Boston. Don't tell me it's a professional league. I don't care if there's a staff masseuse when you can't live in Boston on $30,000. It doesn't matter if it's a 6-month season. This is not professional. So I'm not going to believe it's a professional league.
Wow. Wow, we're getting into it. We are doing it. I mean, these are conversations. You're absolutely right. These are conversations. And I have been saying for years that whatever this next iteration, now we know it's the PWHL of women's hockey, as Fat Joe so eloquently said, yesterday's price is not today's price. And so, yes, the PWHL has a collective bargaining agreement. We have talked about that on this podcast here. Am I excited that it exists? Of course. Am I thrilled after I read it? No.
Nope. An 8-year collective bargaining agreement. I have concerns.
I mean, we sit in a time where at the end of this year, 2024, the WNBA, who was heralded as having the most comprehensive CBA certainly ever in their history, and still I would argue, and although the NWSL kind of came along as well, I'm more familiar with the WNBA collective bargaining agreement, but they knew when they signed that, as is the case with contract negotiations at this level, right? That there were things that were left on the negotiating table that they would then fight for in the next cycle. The thing that we know in the WNBA collective bargaining agreement is that there is an opt-out clause. It is the way that the CBA for the PWHL is written. There are a lot of things that are vague, and they are addressed in a way where it's kind of like, yeah, like this will probably come up at some point, and when it does, we'll have a conversation and a meeting of the minds, and then we'll decide from there. That's a really vague contract, and maybe it'll work out. But the separation between the PWHL and the PWHL-PA is not as concrete as the WNBA and the WNBPA. And let me remind folks, because this is not an indictment on the PWHL. I'm spitting only facts here. Read the CBA if you so choose. We have to remember that that separation, even in the presence of a CBA, took years for the WNBA, to the point where things that we now call NIL, mostly because of people talking at the NCAA level, there was not autonomy for the union to negotiate NIL rights for their own players until really the last I think if I'm being generous, I want to say like 7 years, but it's really been like the last 5 or so years. And the money coming to the PA was coming directly from the league. And there, yes, of course, will always be that when it comes to a union. But for that to be the only way, and for the CBA and the way that the policies are enacted in the CBA to make it that a union effectively does not have autonomy over their players' name, image, and likeness, nor can they negotiate contracts for the collective without having to go to Big Brother, because I'm not talking about the WNBA. That's another thing that people misunderstand. The WNBA is just starting now to get separation and its own autonomy from the NBA. So when WNBPA players, when the union is having these conversations, yes, the WNBA and Kathy Engelbert, now they finally have an actual commissioner, is in those meetings. But you know who else is there? Adam Silver and his team, the NBA.
And this is one of those larger places, Erica, where I continue to wonder the ways that pro-women's leagues sometimes implicitly think that modeling ourselves on men's leagues is the smartest take possible. And whether that's about hitting on open ice or the way we negotiate contracts, I'm not always convinced that this is the best way forward, right? There's a lot, and where solidarity looks like when we learn across leagues. Look, I come from more of the soccer world, where what I desperately desire is that the abuse that started in and is cultivated in a system that teaches young athletes that their bodies are not their own, moves through league after league after league, such that when the NWSL interviewed, it was the report that was given to the NWSL from Sally Yates said that players could not even recognize their own abuse because they had been so conditioned from their youth to not even know what constituted abuse. Heaven forbid that every other league that includes women and non-binary athletes endures the same thing. But I fear it's true, right? And so this is the thing. Let us learn from one another instead of replicating the same mistake.
Yeah, absolutely. And our third period was actually going to talk about this in the hockey context. And so I just want to let people know, whether you're watching with us live or you're watching on replay, this will be a trigger warning. We are going to talk about Hockey Canada, not in any detail. We just want to give brief updates on what's happening. But to your point, Laura, unfortunately, we saw a really painful reckoning in gymnastics. We saw a painful reckoning in soccer. And that reckoning doesn't seem to ever come for hockey. That's my opinion before we get into what we're talking about here. And I think there are a lot of reasons. We talked about that on this podcast in the past. But this, good old hockey game, play for the name on the front, not on the back. I mean, there's all of these different ways where hockey is its own culture. And there's a beautiful part of that culture that I absolutely enjoy and I'm very grateful for. And there's an ugly part of that culture. And so I am going to just read briefly. This is coming from the Associated Press, but we have to give, as it were, stick taps to Globe and Mail. The athletic staff has also been keeping up with this story. But for those who are not familiar, the 2018 Canada World Juniors team, there have been reports, and there is a woman that came forward alleging sexual assault. And the update that we got earlier this week, yesterday, this coming from the Associated Press, 5 players from Canada's 2018 World Junior team have taken a leave of absence from their current clubs in recent days amid a report that 5 members of that team have been asked to surrender to police to face sexual assault charges. Now, we have players from the New Jersey Devils, Philadelphia Flyers, and the Calgary Flames, as well as a former NHL player now playing in Europe, who were all, quote, granted indefinite leave with the absences announced over the past 4 days. Now, on the one hand, I was raised by a lawyer, but I am not a lawyer, but I just want to anchor this in what happens when there are legal proceedings and court filings, police reports, etc. For there to be no comment from the teams that I listed and the people even that are being asked to surrender, that is not uncommon, because in almost every country and through the law, you do have a right not to incriminate yourself. And so it would behoove you, as you're going through a process, to limit the statements that you're making until you are in a situation where statements are necessitated. So I just want to put that out there just to anchor us in what to expect, which is quite honestly not a lot of anything. But Laura, this has gone on. I mean, this is a 2018 incident that is now just starting in 2024 to be handled by London police. And unfortunately, we have instance after instance, including who is the player who was released from the Chicago team and is now, where is he? Corey, is that the, who is that? I'm thinking, I'm sorry. I don't know all the men's hockey stuff. Anyway, what I want to say is, so that's what's happening with the 2018 junior team. The reason I mentioned the gentleman, and I should have wrote it in the notes, but it's escaping me right now. He was dismissed from the Chicago team for violating, he was, we didn't know exactly why, but the Chicago team released him. A lot of people speculating. Unfortunately, Connor Bedard and his family got into some nasty rumors regarding that, which we're not going to get into. But then also this week, it was reported that this player, sorry to this man, I can't remember your name, but he was intoxicated, apparently, and he made some unprofessional and inappropriate remarks towards an employee. And the fact that in 2024, after Kyle Beach, after what's been happening in the reporting around the junior team in Hockey Canada, that people don't understand that you can and are absolutely, and an employer is absolutely empowered to release you from a contract, aka fire you, if you are being inappropriate without there being any quote unquote laws broken. I just don't understand where we are as a society, where it's literally like, it feels like that quote from The Hangover, and it's like, well, did you die? And I mean, not to make a levity of this, but even then, even when life has been lost, we still, as a greater society, make excuses for behavior, generally speaking, especially when it comes from men, white men, powerful, rich white men. I'm so fatigued by our inability to express any feelings of just like decency. Like, it's just wild to me. And we mentioned Harvard also, Laura, and that they have a whole new staff. Coach Bellamy, then Lahovey coach. Why do they have a new coaching staff? Because apparently for 30 plus years, nobody or not enough adults found it inappropriate to do naked skates where players were then required to slide bare on ice. What? What are we doing? Like, what are we actually doing? I went on a complete rant there. I didn't want to spend a lot of time here, but it's just like these things, to your point, when you were saying like the abuse, people don't even notice. In some of the cases with USA Gymnastics, there were other adults in the room while this abuse was happening. And to your point earlier, it was so conditioned as normal that even in those situations, these young athletes were subject to their bodies being violated. When does it end? Like, when does it actually end?
So I hold multiple things in tension in this, in two ways. One is that I don't actually think there's been a reckoning. I think there's been exposure, but I don't think the reckoning will happen when the systems change. And while we still have systems like Safe Sport, that is the ostensible reporting mechanism, reporting enforcement and adjudication system that athletes are told is the vehicle by which you report abuse, but has fail time and time again, but gives a veneer to coaches, parents, athletes, that something has been done. And therefore people think, well, I don't need to go to the police. I've done what I'm supposed to. I've been absolved of responsibility. And either the mechanism of safe sport has failed, or they are so overwhelmed. And I want, which is wildly infuriating. So I don't think we've had that. That is a systemic failure. And because it seduces people into thinking that it works, we have not had the reckoning we need. On the other hand, I hold that despair in tension with what happened within the world of Major League Soccer recently, which is Sporting KC made the dumbest decision to hire Gavin Wilkinson, the former president of the Portland Thorns, who was known to protect abusers on his staff. Now, when people found out about this, it was initially the women's supporters group, and then blessedly, and we want to shout out, this is the work, I'm speaking specifically to the men folk, we need you to come alongside, because this is not just about protecting women, because we see how men have been abused, and the shame, talk about the shame, but we're going to need people in places of privilege to use that privilege in more strategic ways. When the supporters groups and fans, people said, we are going to withhold, and this is what the corporate structures are slowly realizing, we're going to withhold ticket purchasing. We are not going to buy things from you if you hire this fool. That was what changed things. Now, the moral garbage of hiring this individual should have been enough, but it wasn't. But your fans revolting changed things. What we need to see is, what are the fans of Hockey Canada going to do if the system of enforcement doesn't act quickly enough for something that happened in 2018? Do fans of Hockey Canada care more about your hockey or care about the lives of
questions that need answers? And you're right. And I mentioned it earlier. I definitely don't believe that hockey at any level has had a reckoning. And I also appreciate you offering that there is still much more that needs to be done across the board. I mean, you think about the Kyle Beach situation and the investigation that happened from the National Hockey League, in which effectively all of the money, who knows how much money they put into this reporting, for them to say, well, it was definitely the reporting that was wrong, but we can't find an individual who is responsible for the reporting being faulty. And although the reporting is faulty, it's not because the reporting system is faulty, but it's a bad report, but not a bad person or people. And it's definitely not a bad system. So there you go.
And that lack of confidence says to victims, do not bring your story forward.
It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking.
And I hope for folks who are hearing this, what you hear is that you find trusted people to tell your story to. That the telling of this story, even in broken systems, is part of what heals us. That part of what heals us is telling our stories out loud. That how we get whole, we who love sports, is we stop being afraid to tell our stories, even when we know we're in a broken system. Because we know it's broken. But what Black Rosie is so good at is saying we're going to do it anyway. This is why we tell stories. This is why we lift up stories anyway. We know this is a broken system, but the joy of the game is still worth playing and still worth highlighting stories. Look, Safe Sports isn't going to save us. Hockey Canada isn't going to save us. Nobody else is going to save us, but we do it together. We find these little pods and we tell the stories anyway. And maybe you put together a team and you say, we're going to do this together anyway. And we know it's a broken system, but you put together a team to go into a broken system with you.
Wow.
I got to preaching. It's my other job.
No, please. Like, I want to just take a moment and let's just give virtual hugs. I'm so grateful for you and for your words. It is difficult. And like you said, or what I heard, what I took from what you said is that it is difficult. It will be difficult. We know the system is broken. It doesn't serve us to act and to pretend and to look away when we see it broken and pretend that it's not. Yeah. And for our own sake, which is also important, and finding a way to speak your truth looks different at different stages. I also think that's fair to say, to ask someone questions and to question why and how and when they tell their own story of abuse is, in my opinion, an extremely unkind and uninformed thing to do. So what I will offer is, and I say this a lot and I try to practice it, please, if I ever misspeak, if I'm using language that makes you uncomfortable, if I am, appropriating anything or any of the things that I haven't mentioned that can create an uncomfortable and unsafe space, I always would appreciate the opportunity to learn from those experiences. Not that it's anyone's job to do that, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I'm always open to having those conversations because it is important to me to create a community in hockey. And it might not feel great from my perspective. I might not understand completely why something that I did without any intention of being harmful was harmful. But when someone says to you, this is harmful, this is inappropriate, that was unprofessional, I have the choice, regardless of my feelings, regardless of my ignorance in that moment, to take a minute and to reflect and to find a way to repair harm. Because my intent is not the issue. It's the lack of understanding or taking the time out to understand and appreciate where someone is coming from. So that's number one. And I hope that we continue to create that space where we can have these conversations. These are important conversations. They're extremely difficult conversations at any given time. I thought I was going to cry at least 5 times as we were talking, which is something that is extremely uncomfortable just for me. It's a vulnerability of mine that I don't often share. And those things, the discomfort, even the expressing of emotion, is part of the way through. It's how we find our people, to your point. It's how we come to a better understanding. And once we get through those essential parts of healing, it is then that we can steel ourselves for the work ahead that is required. It is absolutely required and necessary for us not to only hear and to empathize and sympathize with people's stories of abuse. It is required, not of everyone at the same time, at least that's not my opinion, but it is required that society makes changes. And too often we have people in power that are not willing to take that next step. So I want us to be able to do that together. And a part of that is having open conversations. And I think another part of that is being able to celebrate the beauty. Just because something was hurtful and harmful in one specific area doesn't mean that all of it is bad. It doesn't mean that we can't have conversations and come back together, generally, broadly speaking. And so that's what I hope we can do here. And we wanted to close out talking a little bit about PWHL New York and their media day. But first, Laura, I think we should just take like a little moment of silence and let everyone recalibrate and just get their energy in a good space. There's a Kiswahili word, ashe, which effectively translated in English means so let it be. We don't have to affirm or deny anything, but we accept this moment and that we can and we will move forward from it. So thank you, everyone, if you're still with us, if you're hanging out with us live, or if you are watching the replay. We're going to have these conversations, and I'm so glad that we have Boston Women's Sports and we have Laura with us to have these conversations as well. But we don't want to end on a heavy note. These are important conversations. And again, we can find joy, and we should enjoy. And I had a great time in New York. I know, Laura, you were a little bit put out that we have Corrine Schroeder, but let's go to Chloe Arard, who played for Northeastern. She's going to talk a little bit about what she was doing during Tuesday's Beanpot Championship. She's sitting next to Jade Downey-Landry, who had the first ever PWHL New York hat trick, but you're going to hear from Chloe in these just a handful of questions that I asked her at yesterday's media day.
Okay, fantastic. Just make sure my backup audio's on. Okay, I'm just gonna kind of split the difference between you two. Okay, Chloe, first, I wanted to ask you if you were able to take in any of the women's Beanpot last night.
Yes, I watched the whole game. My coach called me, actually, my coach from Northeastern, and he asked me to go, but it was a tight turnaround. But he said there was around 7,000 people there, and then when I watched the game, I tuned in, and it was more than 10,000 people. So it was crazy. It was just crazy. I don't even have any words. I was speechless. I actually thought I was watching an NHL game, so it's crazy to watch. But yeah.
And to be an alum of that program and to see them be the first team, not to win, obviously, Beanpot, you've got 19 now, but to win at the game played at TD Garden, what does that mean to you?
It's amazing. I'm super proud of them, and they deserve it. We've been trying to build something over the past 5 years that I've been there, and it's great to see that they accomplished it. TD Garden is a huge arena in Boston. It's the arena of Boston, so it's great that they got to play there. It's even better that they got over 10,000 people, and it's even cherry on top of the cake. They won the Beanpot there, so I think they just made history once again, winning the Beanpot in TD Garden, and super happy for them. They're gonna remember for the rest of their life.
So PWHL Boston playing a home game at TD Garden when, Laura?
I think we name it and claim it. I think not this year, but let's talk about playing there next year. Look, we had the opportunity to interview Northeastern head coach Dave Flint after the game, and he talked about how all of the coaches together, the women's hockey coaches across the leagues get together, and he was reflecting that a couple of years ago, we had a meeting in Naples every year with the coaches. He said, all the coaches from all the leagues get together and we talk about our issues. We were fighting not that long ago just to find a way to get our national championship on TV. Mm-hmm. There was paintball on ESPN, but they wouldn't carry a women's hockey game. That's from Northeastern head coach Dave Flint, reflecting after the Beanpot. Look, so not that long ago, the Frozen Four couldn't even get on ESPN while ESPN was carrying paintball. So we're not that long ago. Remember, NCAA didn't acknowledge women's hockey until 2000, right? So it's frustrating. It's wildly frustrating that the Beanpot has been played in Boston by women for 45 years when it was a club sport, started at Northeastern in 1979. It's ridiculous to me that it took this long to finally have the women play at the Garden when the men have been there for such a long time. And yet, we showed everyone that when women play, we put out quality product, quality hockey, and 10,633 people showed up. So don't tell me we can't put a pro women's hockey game at the Garden. We're going to be there, and it's going to be great.
That's our show, folks. I mean, there's really nothing else.
Erica.
Oh, you already know. You already know. I'm gutted that I won't be up on Friday when Sam Mewis drops the puck. That's going to be exciting.
Sammy Bananas on Saturday. We're going to be in Lowell. We're going to play Minnesota, and I'm really excited.
Friday, Saturday. Sorry.
Yeah,
that's right. Because Minnesota then comes to New York / Connecticut. So New York got really fancy. We're just inheriting multiple states, not just
you all
areas
can
in
have Connecticut. We don't want it. It's fine. We don't want it.
Oh my goodness. Yes, that's right. So I'm sorry. That game is on Saturday, Minnesota.
Saturday at 4 in Lowell.
That's right. And then Minnesota will make their way down to Connecticut, the Nutmeg State, and take on PWHL New York. But Laura Everrett, thank you so much. This was so much fun. I cannot overstate how just warm it felt to receive your energy at TD Garden. I'm so grateful that you said hello. I'm glad that you joined me on the show today. And we have to do this again for sure, because we just have to do all the hockey, all the WOHO, as I say. But before we head out of here, please let folks know what you have coming down the pike and how they can support women's, Boston women's hockey, excuse me.
Sure. So we're certainly covering the game. And if you like soccer, we want to encourage you to follow what we're doing at Boss Women's Sports on all of the platforms. The NWSL bid for Boston is the rehab of White Stadium here in Boston proper, in Franklin Park. We're rehabbing a historic stadium. It's a fascinating bid. Public-private partnership, really interesting in terms of city and an all-women's ownership group. Folks don't always remember this, but Boston is a majority-minority city, and to have a stadium in the center of the city is just a really incredible opportunity. So we have the Boston Renegades, the winningest women's football team of all time, is also here. We have a 45-year-old quarterback. The team hasn't lost since 2018. So if you like pro football and you're tired of the Patriots, may we invite you to the Boston Renegades.
Yes.
Lots more fun, and we think they're pretty incredible. So we cover all of the pro women's sports teams, and are always looking for more folks who want to be a part of what we're doing. We have held a few events at a local Dominican Latino-owned bar. So if you want to join us at Fart Hill Bar and Grill, that's where we post up. So
I love it.
Yeah, really.
Whippa! I love it. I'm not Dominican, but I might as well be. We're very close cousins, Dominicans, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans. So I love that. I saw some of that on social, and I was like, oh man. All right.
Dominican karaoke was new for many of us, but all threw down. It was pretty incredible. After
that is fantastic. I love it.
We're having a blast here, and I'm really grateful to be on the Founding Four.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. The Founding Four is the flagship podcast of Black Rosie Media, where we empower Black women and melanated creators overall in sports media. We have switched the Founding Four podcast to a live stream on YouTube model. So we're going to be going every week now that women's hockey is back in action. Angelica Rodriguez is my co-host. She couldn't join us tonight, but we will have her back soon, and we will definitely bring you back, Laura, sometime soon. Bon chance to Boston this weekend. Hope you enjoy the game. I look forward to your coverage. And for those who follow Black Rosie Media, we are going to give you more of the interviews from PWHL New York Media Day. We have some on social media already. We have a lot of stuff that's coming up first for our Patreon members. So if you're not already a member of our Patreon posse, as I like to say, go ahead and sign up, subscribe. That is a great way to support independent coverage. You can also do the same for Boston women's sports. Make sure that you are supporting independent coverage. And if you're able, we appreciate it, because that is what allows us to make sure that our coverage, at least in our case at Black Rosie Media, that as much of it is free for all viewers as possible. All right. Well, for Laura Everrett, I am Erica L. Ayala. As I say on my men's hockey podcast, be kind to yourselves, be kind to one another, and we'll catch you on the next live stream. Peace out, everybody. Thank you.